Feeding 80 people from one pot sounds impossible until you understand that mountain villages have been doing exactly that for centuries. They do it with less equipment than most people own in a single kitchen drawer. My name is Samuel Mast. I farmed 200 acres of Amish land in Millersburg, Ohio, for 30 years. We fed large gatherings often, church meals, harvest celebrations, sometimes 50 people or more from a handful of pots over open fire. That experience is exactly why this dish caught my attention the moment I first saw it made. I left my community and kept learning new methods wherever I found them worth learning. This one, a massive lamb pilaf cooked for a mountain village feast, is one of the most impressive examples of large batch cooking. Today, I'm walking you through exactly how it's done. Let me be upfront about this one, since honesty matters more to me than pretending I invented something I didn't. This dish belongs to mountain communities in Central Asia, where cooking rice and lamb together for an entire village isn't a special occasion. It's simply how large gatherings have been fed for generations, using a method refined over centuries specifically because it works reliably. What drew me to this dish wasn't the spices or the presentation. It was the pot itself, and the philosophy behind cooking this way. One vessel, feeding dozens of people, using cuts of meat and simple ingredients, built up in careful layers rather than complicated technique. That's a philosophy I understand completely from my own years cooking for large groups, even though the specific dish is new to me. Let's talk about the pot first, since this decision affects everything else about how this dish comes together. Traditional mountain village pilaf is cooked in a kazan, a large, wide, thick-walled pot, usually cast iron or heavy steel. This shape matters. It allows heat to distribute evenly across a large volume of food, while giving enough surface area for meat to brown. The rounded sides also mean heat wraps around the food rather than concentrating only at the bottom, something a flat-sided pot cannot replicate. If you don't have a kazan, the closest substitute is a large, heavy stock pot, at least 12 quarts, or a deep cast iron Dutch oven. What matters most is thickness and heat retention, not the exact shape, since a thin pot will scorch rice and burn meat. For a genuinely massive batch, feeding 30 to 40 people, you're looking at a pot in the range of 15 to 20 quarts. This isn't cookware most households keep, but it's the kind of heavy-duty vessel found at restaurant supply stores for reasonable prices. If a pot this large feels excessive, remember that everything in this recipe scales down proportionally. Cutting every ingredient in half comfortably serves 15 to 20 people using a standard stock pot most households already own. Now let's talk about the meat, since lamb is central to this dish, and choosing the right cut affects flavor and texture. Lamb shoulder is the ideal cut. It has enough fat marbled through the muscle to stay tender through an extended cook. Bone-in shoulder, cut into chunks roughly 3 to 4 inches each, works best, since the bone adds depth of flavor. For a large feast, serving 30 to 40 people, plan on roughly 8 to 10 pounds of lamb shoulder. This might sound like an enormous amount, but remember, this dish is meant to feed an entire gathering, not a single family dinner. If your butcher doesn't carry this regularly, calling ahead gives them time to set aside exactly what you need at a better price. Buying a larger cut and asking the butcher to break it down into chunks for you also saves considerable time. Now, rice. This is where precision actually matters more than most people expect, since the wrong variety changes the entire texture. Long-grain rice is essential, specifically a variety that holds its shape and stays separate rather than turning sticky or mushy. For this scale of feast, plan on roughly 6 to 8 cups of dry rice, which expands significantly once cooked. Rinse this rice thoroughly before cooking, several times in cold water, until the water runs mostly clear rather than cloudy. This step removes excess surface starch, preventing the rice from clumping into a sticky mass. Texture is everything in this dish. Let's talk about the remaining core ingredients. Onions and carrots form the foundation underneath everything else. You'll need a generous amount of onions, roughly 3 to 4 pounds, sliced thick rather than diced fine. Carrots, cut into thick matchsticks rather than thin shreds, add flavor and a natural sweetness that balances the lamb fat. Traditional preparation cuts these by hand into long, thick strips. Not the thin, shredded carrots you'd find pre-bagged. Garlic, left in whole, unpeeled heads, gets nestled directly into the rice, where it slowly softens and infuses the entire dish. This is a detail that surprised me, since it goes against nearly every instinct about how garlic is normally used. For fat, this dish traditionally uses rendered lamb fat and vegetable oil. It builds the flavor base everything is built on. For home cooking, a neutral vegetable oil combined with fat trimmed directly from your lamb shoulder works just as well. I want to walk you through the actual cooking process from start to finish, building each layer correctly in that large pot. It is the specific timing that turns raw ingredients into a dish capable of feeding an entire mountain village from one single pot. Now, let's talk about the actual cooking process, since this is where every ingredient comes together in a specific order. This process cannot be rushed or rearranged without changing the final result. Start by heating your fat in the bottom of that large pot. If you're using lamb fat trimmed from the shoulder, render it first, letting the solid pieces melt down slowly until you're left with liquid fat. You will have small, crisp cracklings, which you can either remove or leave in for extra flavor throughout the dish. Add vegetable oil alongside this rendered fat, enough to coat the bottom of the pot generously, roughly 1 to 1.5 cups. Once the fat is shimmering and hot, add your lamb chunks in batches, never crowding the pot at any point during this step. Overcrowding drops the temperature immediately, and instead of browning, the meat simply steams in its own liquid, preventing deep color and flavor. Brown the lamb on all sides, working in batches if needed, removing each batch to a separate bowl once it's developed a dark crust. This browning stage typically takes 8 to 10 minutes per batch, and it's worth being patient here, as this crust provides significant flavor. This is the same principle behind searing any cut of meat properly before it goes into a longer cook. Once all your lamb is browned and set aside, it's time for the onions. Add your thickly sliced onions directly into that same pot. Stir them through, scraping up any browned bits stuck to the pot, letting the onions cook down slowly over medium heat. Cook these onions for a full 15 to 20 minutes, stirring occasionally until they've turned deeply golden and soft. This slow breakdown is exactly what builds the deep, sweet foundation this entire dish rests on. Rushing this stage with higher heat browns the onions unevenly and can introduce bitterness rather than the sweetness you're after. Once the onions have fully softened and turned golden, add your carrots directly on top, stirring them through briefly for 2 to 3 minutes. The carrots will continue cooking later as the rice and liquid go in, so this stage is simply about getting them coated in flavor. Now, return your browned lamb back into the pot, nestling the pieces down into the onion and carrot mixture. Add enough water to just cover the meat and vegetables, along with salt, cumin seeds, and whole coriander seeds. Bring this mixture to a gentle simmer, then reduce the heat to low. Cover the pot, and let it cook undisturbed for 90 minutes. This is the stage where the lamb truly becomes tender, the connective tissue and collagen breaking down slowly into the surrounding liquid. Check the lamb after an hour by testing a piece with a fork. It should pull apart icily with minimal resistance. Once your lamb is properly tender, it's time for the rice, and this stage requires more attention than anything that's come before. Drain your rinsed and soaked rice thoroughly, then spread it evenly over the top of the lamb and vegetable mixture. Do not stir it. The rice sits as a distinct layer on top, allowing it to steam gently from the liquid and aromatics rising up through it. Using the back of a spoon, gently press several holes down through the rice layer, allowing steam and liquid to rise up evenly. This step matters, as without these channels, steam can build unevenly, leaving some sections undercooked while others turn mushy. Now nestle in those whole, unpeeled garlic heads, pressing them down slightly into the rice so they're partially covered. Check your liquid level. The rice needs enough liquid remaining to fully cook through via steam, typically barely visible at the edges. If your liquid looks low, add a small amount of hot water carefully around the edges of the pot. Never poured directly over the rice. Cover the pot tightly now, using a tight-fitting lid or a clean kitchen towel to trap every bit of steam inside. Reduce your heat to the lowest possible setting and let the pot cook undisturbed for a full 30 to 40 minutes. Resist any urge to lift that lid. Every time you lift it, you release trapped steam the rice depends on to cook through properly. After 30 minutes, check by uncovering briefly and tasting a small amount of rice. It should be tender, with each grain distinct. Once the rice is fully tender, turn off the heat, but leave the pot covered and undisturbed for an additional 15 minutes. This final resting period lets everything settle and finish absorbing any remaining moisture evenly throughout the dish. I want to walk you through how this dish gets served at an actual mountain village feast, with the specific plating tradition behind it. We will look at portioning for a crowd of 30 people, and the cost breakdown compared to a catered feast. Now let's talk about serving this dish the way it's actually served at a genuine mountain village feast. Since the presentation carries so much meaning, traditional plating for this dish uses a large, shared communal platter rather than individual plates. A detail that reflects the entire spirit of the meal. The rice gets spread first across the base of this large platter, spread wide and generous, since it forms the foundation the rest sits on. Uncover your pot carefully once that final resting period has finished, and you'll notice the layers have settled into something visually distinct. Lift the rice out gently using a wide, flat spoon, working from the top down, transferring it without pressing or packing it down. Keep those individual grains loose and separate the way properly cooked rice should look. Once the rice covers the base, the lamb comes next, lifted out in large, tender pieces, arranged across the top rather than mixed through. This visual layering, rice below, meat above, is intentional and traditional, letting anyone see exactly what they're getting before they reach for a portion. The softened carrots get scattered across the top as well, their color providing a natural visual contrast against the pale rice and darker lamb. Those whole garlic heads, now soft and caramelized, get placed whole on top as a garnish, meant to be broken apart onto individual portions. This style of communal serving reflects how these feasts function socially, with everyone gathered around one large platter, taking portions together. Amish church gatherings and harvest meals worked the same way. Large, shared dishes at the center of long tables, everyone serving themselves. Let's talk about portioning now, since feeding a crowd this size requires planning that goes beyond what a normal household meal ever needs. For a full feast serving 30 to 40 people, 8 to 10 pounds of lamb and 6 to 8 cups of rice typically works out well. A reasonable planning estimate is about 3/4 of a cup of rice, combined with roughly 4 to 5 ounces of lamb per adult portion. This dish reheats remarkably well, arguably even better the following day. Once the flavors have had additional time to settle and meld, to reheat, Add a small splash of water or broth to the rice before warming it over low heat to bring back its original texture. Now let's talk about cost. A catered feast for 30 to 40 people typically runs anywhere from $500 to $1,200. Compare this to the actual ingredient cost. Lamb, shoulder, rice, onions, and carrots together land between $100 and $130. This is a fraction of the cost. Producing a dish that connects directly to genuine culinary tradition rather than something assembled for convenience. A quality 15 to 20 quart stock pot represents your primary investment, typically costing between $40 and $80. It's a one-time purchase, reused for every future large gathering, not a cost specific to this single dish alone. I want to bring this full circle, reflecting on how this method connects my farming background to a tradition from an entirely different world. It shares nearly everything in common with how my own community once fed itself. Authentic, communal, and deeply meaningful. Let's talk about variations on this dish now, since once you understand the core method, small changes let you adapt it. Beef can replace lamb entirely for anyone who doesn't have easy access to lamb shoulder, or simply prefers a different flavor profile. Chuck roast follows the exact same browning and simmering process, though it typically needs slightly longer in that initial simmering stage. Chicken works as a lighter alternative, though it changes the character of the dish significantly. Bone-in chicken thighs need considerably less simmering time before the rice goes in, closer to 30 minutes rather than a full hour. For a version closer to mountain communities, dried fruit, particularly raisins or dried apricots, gets added alongside the carrots partway through cooking. A generous handful, roughly 1 cup total, works well without overwhelming the dish's primary savory flavors. Let's talk about a different approach for smaller gatherings. Since not every occasion calls for a pot large enough to feed 40 people. Scaling this recipe down to a quarter, using roughly 2 pounds of lamb and 2 cups of rice, produces a family-sized version. The method stays identical, just compressed into smaller quantities and correspondingly shorter cooking times throughout each stage. This scaled-down version is worth trying first if you've never attempted this dish before, to learn the timing on a manageable scale. Let's talk about a few common mistakes, since a few specific errors account for most disappointing results people report. The most common mistake is stirring the rice into the meat rather than letting it sit as a distinct layer on top. This destroys the steaming principle, resulting in rice that's unevenly cooked, mushy in some areas and undercooked in others. A second common mistake is lifting the lid repeatedly during that final steaming stage, checking on progress out of curiosity. Every time that lid comes off, trapped steam escapes, and the rice on top loses the environment it needs to cook through. A third mistake involves rushing the initial onion cooking stage, using higher heat to speed through a slow process. Onions rushed this way brown unevenly, sometimes turning bitter in spots while remaining undercooked in others. A fourth mistake is undersalting the initial simmering liquid before the rice goes in. Underseasoning at this point means the finished dish often tastes flat overall, even if individual bites of lamb taste properly seasoned. Let's talk about make-ahead planning. Since organizing a feast for 30 benefits from breaking this process into stages across 2 days, the initial browning and simmering stage can be done a full day ahead of time, then refrigerated overnight. This actually improves the final flavor, giving the meat and vegetables extra time for those flavors to deepen and meld together. On the day of your gathering, simply reheat this mixture gently until it returns to a steady simmer, then proceed. Let's talk about what to serve alongside this dish, since a feast benefits from a few simple additions. A simple, sharp salad of tomatoes, cucumbers, and red onion provides a fresh, acidic contrast against the richness of the pilaf. Flatbread works well here too, useful for scooping portions directly from that communal platter in the traditional style. A simple yogurt sauce, plain yogurt thinned with water and salt, offers another cooling contrast for guests to spoon over their portion. I want to close this out by walking through the full process one more time as one clear reference from start to finish. This dish taught me about the connection between my background and a tradition from another world that understood exactly the same lesson. Here is the complete process laid out clearly from start to finish, so you have everything in one place before you attempt this yourself. Choose your pot first, a heavy stock pot or Dutch oven, at least 15 quarts for a full feast serving 30 to 40 people, or scaled down to a standard 6 to 8 quart pot if you're cooking for a smaller gathering of 6 to 8 people instead. Render your fat and brown 8 to 10 pounds of lamb shoulder chunks in batches, never crowding the pot. Setting each browned batch aside once it's developed a deep, dark crust on every side. Cook 3 to 4 pounds of thickly sliced onions slowly in that same fat for a full 15 to 20 minutes, until deeply golden and nearly collapsed. Then add 3 to 4 pounds of thick-cut carrots for a brief 2 to 3 minutes. Return the browned lamb to the pot, cover with water. Season generously with salt and whole spices, and simmer covered for 1 hour, until the meat pulls apart easily with a fork. Layer 6 to 8 cups of rinsed, drained rice evenly over the top without stirring. Press several holes down through to the meat below. Nestle in whole garlic heads. Check your liquid level, then cover tightly and steam on the lowest heat for 30 to 40 minutes, resisting the urge to lift that lid. Let the finished pot rest, covered and off the heat, for 10 to 15 more minutes. Then layer it onto a large communal platter. Rice first, lamb and carrots on top. Garlic scattered across the surface, ready to serve. That is the entire dish, using one pot, basic ingredients, and time, feeding a crowd for a quarter of what catering would charge. I want to close with something this whole process taught me, something I didn't expect to find when I first watched this dish being made. My own community fed large gatherings using exactly this same underlying logic. One pot, simple, honest ingredients. Layers built with patience rather than rushed through with shortcuts. Everyone gathered around the same shared source of food. I always assumed that logic belonged specifically to Amish farming life. Something particular to how my own community organized itself around scarcity. Learning this dish taught me that mountain villages, thousands of miles away, with a completely different history, arrived at the same conclusion. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when necessity and generations of practice shape a method long enough. Whether it's an Amish farmhouse kitchen in Ohio, or a mountain village kitchen half a world away, the same basic truths hold. Good food, made for a crowd, doesn't require excess. It requires understanding your ingredients and respecting the time each step needs. I recognized something because it spoke the same language every large, honest meal I ever helped prepare has always spoken. Feed people well, waste nothing. Let the pot, the fire, and the time do the work a shortcut never actually can. That's the dish, and that's everything I learned making it.